The floor cracked beneath my feet, and I fell hard into the dark. For a moment, there was nothing but dust and the ringing in my ears. Then the emergency lights flickered on, painting the collapsed chamber in dim red, and I understood how close I had come to dying alone in a tomb that was older than my own species. My name is Nora Vance. I am an archivist for the Assembly, the union of species that studies the ruins left behind by civilizations that no longer exist. That is my job. I walk through dead cities. I read dead languages. I catalog the bones of the universe so that the living might learn something from them. I did not expect to almost die doing it. The fall itself had not been an accident, not entirely. I had been moving too quickly through a corridor the official survey teams had already marked as unstable, ignoring every sign that told me to turn back, because something ahead of me in the dark kept pulling my attention forward instead. A faint hum, barely audible, coming from somewhere deeper in the ruin. I told myself it was just settling stone, the ordinary sound of old architecture shifting under its own weight after 9,000 years. I did not fully believe that, even as I told it to myself. Halfway down that corridor, the floor beneath me had simply given way, as if the moon itself had decided it did not want me going any further. I remember the strange, weightless second before I hit the rubble below, and I remember thinking, quite clearly and quite calmly, that if I died here, no one would even know where to look for my body for months. The chamber I had been exploring belonged to a species called the Threll, extinct for nearly 9,000 years. Their ruins were spread across a moon with no name, just a designation number, in a system so far from anywhere that most ships never bothered to stop. I had come here alone, against advice, because the official survey teams had already left, and I was not ready to leave with them. Something about this place had been calling to me for weeks, ever since I first read the survey notes back at the station. Every dead civilization the Assembly has ever catalogued leaves ruins that tell a story. Sometimes it is a story of war. Sometimes it is a story of disease, or a dying star, or a mistake with a machine too powerful to control. But the Threll ruins told a different story, and it was the same story I had already found twice before, in two completely different systems, among two completely different species who could not possibly have known each other. Carved into the last surviving wall of their deepest chamber, in a language that took me 3 years to translate, were 5 words repeated over and over, as if the Threll needed to remind themselves again and again before the end. Never wake the humans. I pulled myself up out of the rubble and brushed the dust from my sleeves. My hands were shaking, and not just from the fall. I had seen this warning before. I had read it in the frozen halls of a species called the Aura, who vanished 6,000 years ago on a planet made of ice. I had found it scratched into a doorframe belonging to the Mendrai, a hive mind species that once controlled 100 worlds and then, over the course of a single generation, controlled nothing at all. 3 different species, 3 different eras, 3 different corners of the galaxy, all extinct, all leaving the exact same warning behind, as if it had been passed down like a curse nobody could stop repeating. I switched on my recorder, more out of habit than anything else, because my hands needed something to do. This is Nora Vance, archive log, personal record. I have confirmed the 3rd instance of the warning phrase at the Threll site. The translation is consistent with previous findings. I believe this is not a coincidence. I believe someone needs to know this is not a coincidence. I stopped recording and looked around the chamber. Half of it was buried under fallen stone from my fall, but the other half was still intact, and in the center of it stood something none of the previous sites had: a console, dark, dead, coated in centuries of dust, but whole, untouched by whatever disaster had ended this civilization. My hands moved before my mind caught up with them. I knelt beside it, wiped away the dust, and found a small panel that had somehow, impossibly, still held a trickle of power, enough for one final function. A star map blinked to life above the console, faint and flickering, showing a single point of light circled in red. Beneath it, in the same trembling Threll script as the warning on the wall, were coordinates. Not a warning this time, a location. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it over the settling dust around me. Every extinct species we had ever studied described the same enemy, always in the same fearful tone, always using variations of the same word: humans. And every single record the assembly possessed insisted that humans had been extinct for tens of thousands of years, wiped out by some ancient catastrophe long before any current species had even developed spaceflight. It was one of the oldest facts in our archives, a closed case, a footnote in galactic history. But these coordinates were not marked as a grave, they were marked as a location, active tense, present tense, as if whoever carved this map believed that whatever was out there was still alive. I ran the calculation twice, because I did not trust myself the first time. The coordinates matched no cemetery world in any assembly record. They matched no known ruin, no known memorial, no known site of any kind. They pointed to a system that, according to every database I had access to, had never been surveyed at all. I sat back on my heels in that broken chamber, surrounded by 9,000 years of silence, and I felt something I had never felt in 6 years of archive work. Not curiosity, not the quiet thrill of solving an old puzzle. Fear. Real fear, cold and immediate, the kind that makes the hair rise on your arms even when nothing in the room has moved. I should have reported it immediately. That was the protocol. Any anomaly involving the extinction warnings was supposed to go straight to the Cultural Preservation Council. No exceptions, no personal investigation. I knew the rule. I had read it 100 times in training. I did not follow it. Instead, I copied the coordinates into my own private files, sealed the chamber behind me as best I could, and left the moon that same night without telling anyone what I had found. It took me 2 days to reach the nearest assembly station, a modest research outpost called Halvern Reach, where I hoped to find someone I trusted enough to talk to before I did anything else. That person was Reska Ilvain, a fellow archivist who had worked beside me for 3 years, and who, unlike most people at the station, actually listened when I spoke, instead of waiting for her turn to talk. I found her in the records wing, surrounded by towers of translated texts, and I did not even wait for her to greet me before I set my recorder on the table between us and played back everything: the wall, the map, the coordinates, all of it. She listened without interrupting, which was rare for her, and when the recording ended, she sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the little glowing dot of the star map still projected above my recorder. "That is not a memorial marker," she said finally. "I have seen 1,000 memorial markers. That is a location beacon. Someone wanted this place to be findable." I told her what I already suspected, the thing I had been turning over in my mind the entire 2 days of travel. That maybe the warning was not describing a species that used to exist. Maybe it was describing a species that still did. Reska looked at me the way people look at someone who has just said something dangerous out loud in a room that might not be as private as it seemed. "If you are right," she said quietly, "then every civilization that has ever gone extinct in the last 10,000 years has been warning everyone else about a species that the Assembly's own records insist has been dead the entire time. That is not a research question, Nora. That is something someone chose to hide. I did not have an answer for that. All I had was a set of coordinates, a warning carved into stone by hands that no longer existed, and a feeling in my chest that would not go away no matter how many times I told myself I was imagining things. That night, I brought the discovery to my supervisor, a senior archivist named Cale Doran, hoping he would tell me I was wrong, that there was a simple explanation, that I could file my report and go back to my quiet work, translating dead languages in silence. Instead, Cale read through my notes, went very still, and told me to forget I had ever seen them. "This is above your clearance," he said. "It is above mine. Some questions are left alone for a reason, Nora. Whatever is out at those coordinates, it is not our place to go looking for it. I asked him directly whether he already knew something about the warning, something the rest of us had never been told. He did not answer. He simply looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that said more than any answer could have, and then he told me the file would be reviewed through proper channels and that I was to take no further action. I pressed him anyway, because 6 years of working beside him had taught me that Cale Doran never went quiet unless he was hiding something he did not want to lie about outright. I asked him how many times this warning had appeared across assembly records, and whether anyone before me had ever tried to follow it to its source. He hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me more than his words did. "There have been others," he admitted finally, his voice lower than before, as if he did not want the walls of his own office to hear him say it. "Every few centuries, someone finds the pattern the way you found it. Most of them are quietly reassigned before they get very far. A few are not so lucky." I asked him what happened to the ones who were not so lucky, and he simply shook his head and told me the meeting was over. I nodded. I said I understood. I did not understand at all, and I had no intention of doing what he asked. 3 nights later, I stole a small survey vessel from the station's outer dock, loaded the stolen coordinates into its navigation system, and left Halvern Reach before anyone noticed the ship was gone. Reska came with me. She said later that she could not decide whether that made her brave or foolish, and I told her I could not decide either, but that I was glad she was there. As the station shrank behind us and the stars outside the viewport stretched into long streaks of light, I sat at the console and stared at the little red dot on the star map, the one marked with words that had already outlived 3 entire civilizations. "Never wake the humans." I did not know yet what those words truly meant. I did not know that within days I would understand exactly why every species that had ever found this warning had chosen, in the end, to become part of the silence instead of breaking it. All I knew, as our stolen ship carried us further from everything safe and familiar, was that I was about to find out. The alarm tore through the cabin before I even saw what triggered it. Reska was at the secondary console when the proximity sensors screamed, and by the time I reached her side, red warning lights were flooding the small cabin of our stolen ship. Something had locked onto us. Something close. For one horrible second, I thought the assembly had already caught us, that Cale had reported the stolen vessel and a patrol ship was closing in to drag us back to Halvern Reach in chains. Then Reska pulled up the readout and shook her head. "It is not a ship," she said. "It is a signal. Something is broadcasting from directly ahead of us. We had been traveling for 6 days, following the coordinates from the Threll chamber, deeper into a region of space, so empty and unmapped that even our navigation system struggled to plot a clean course. 6 days of silence, 6 days of empty stars, and now, without warning, something was reaching out to touch us before we had even arrived. I dropped into the pilot's seat and cut our speed, easing the ship down from its cruising velocity as the signal grew stronger. It was not an attack. It was not a weapon lock. It was something stranger, and somehow more unsettling than either of those things. It was music. Faint, broken by static, drifting through open space on a frequency so simple and unencrypted that it felt almost careless, like whoever sent it had never once considered that someone dangerous might be listening. A voice sang over rhythm and strings, words in a language neither of us recognized, warm and human in a way that made the hair on my arms rise all over again. Reska looked at me across the cabin, her expression somewhere between wonder and dread. "That is not a distress call," she said. "That is entertainment. Someone out there is just living their life and broadcasting music into space like it is nothing." We dropped out of transit 30 minutes later, and the system opened up in front of us like something out of an old story. A single yellow star, 8 planets, and on the third one, glowing faintly blue and green against the dark, a world that our own assembly records insisted had been a lifeless grave for over 10,000 years. It was not lifeless. It was not a grave. City lights spread across the night side of the planet in glowing threads, following coastlines and rivers the way lights always follow water when a species has learned to build. I counted continents out of habit, the way any archivist counts things when they do not know what else to do with their hands, and every single one of them showed signs of a thriving, active civilization. I sat back in my seat and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Every record I had ever studied, every extinction survey, every catalog entry the assembly possessed, described this species as gone. Not endangered, not scattered. Gone, the way a species is gone, when there is truly nothing left of it but bones and ruins and warnings carved into stone. And yet there it was, lit up and breathing and singing into the void without a single care in the world. Reska ran a long-range scan while I stared at the planet, unable to look away. The results came back strange in a way that made my stomach turn cold. Their technology, according to the scan, was modest. No planetary shields, no orbital defense grid, no visible weapons platforms of any real significance. By every measure the assembly used to judge a civilization's danger level, this world should have been rated as low risk, barely worth a second glance. So why, I asked out loud, more to myself than to her, why would 3 different extinct species leave the same terrified warning about people who cannot even defend their own orbit? Reska did not answer right away. She was too busy staring at a second reading on her console, one that had just appeared and made her go very still. "There is something else," she said quietly. "This is not the first time someone has been here." She turned her screen toward me. Buried deep in the planet's outer atmosphere, faint enough that our first scan had almost missed it, was a pattern of old debris. Not natural, not random. The kind of pattern left behind by a ship, or several ships, that had once hovered exactly where we were hovering now. I asked her how old the debris was. Her answer made the cabin feel colder than it already did. "Thousands of years old," she said, "layered, not from one visit, from many. Someone, or something, has been coming here for a very long time." Against my better judgment, I brought us closer to the debris field, hoping a physical sample might tell us something the scans could not. It was Reska who first noticed that not everything drifting out there was simply broken hull plating. Something among the wreckage was still faintly powered, a dull pulse of energy so old and weak it barely registered against the background static of the system. I eased our ship in slow, careful passes through the field, weaving between fragments of metal that had once belonged to ships built by hands that no longer existed. Reska guided me toward the source of the pulse, and what we found waiting there made my breath catch in my chest. It was a probe, small, ancient, and unmistakably Mendrai in design, still clinging to a fragile thread of power after all this time, its outer casing scarred and pitted from thousands of years adrift. The moment our own ship's sensors brushed against it, something inside the old machine flickered awake. Reska shouted a warning half a second before the probe's remaining systems surged to life, a defensive protocol from a species that had gone extinct millennia ago, still faithfully executing whatever order it had been given the day it was abandoned here. A weak targeting beam swept toward us, harmless against our shields but unmistakable in its intent, the last dying reflex of a long-dead civilization's fear reaching out across 10,000 years to warn us away. I pulled us hard out of the debris field, my hands white-knuckled on the controls, until the probe's feeble signal faded back into silence behind us. Reska let out a breath and laughed, though there was no real humor in it. "Even their machines are still afraid," she said quietly, "even after everything else about them is gone." I did not answer her right away. I was too busy staring at the readout confirming what the probe's brief activation had told us without meaning to. It had been left there deliberately, positioned to watch this exact system, armed and waiting, in case anyone or anything ever came close enough to notice what lay below. Whoever had placed it there had not simply been curious about this world. They had been guarding the rest of the galaxy from it, or perhaps guarding it from the rest of the galaxy. I was no longer certain which, and the uncertainty frightened me more than the probe itself ever could. I pulled up the historical archive files I had brought with me from Halvern Reach, the ones I had quietly copied before we left, and began cross-referencing the debris signatures against known assembly ship designs from the last 10,000 years. None of them matched. Whatever had been visiting this world long before we arrived, it was not us. It was not any species currently active in the assembly. It was the extinct ones, the Threll, the Aura, the Mendrai. All three, at different points in history, according to the layered debris patterns stretched out beneath us, had come to this exact system and hovered in this exact orbit before eventually leaving again. And every single one of them had gone extinct not long after. Reska voiced the thought before I could stop myself from thinking it. They found this place, she said. They studied it, and then they died, all of them. And every single one left the same warning behind before they went. I did not want to believe what my mind was already assembling, piece by piece, the way it always did when a puzzle refused to leave me alone. But the shape of it was there whether I wanted to see it or not. Something about this world, this quiet, unshielded, undefended world, had ended 3 separate civilizations, and each of them, in their final days, had chosen to warn the rest of the galaxy rather than simply vanish in silence. That should have been enough to turn us around. Reska said as much, more than once, in the hours that followed. She argued that we should retreat immediately, report everything to the Council through proper channels, and let people with far more authority than either of us decide what to do next. I agreed with her, in principle. I told her we would leave within the hour. I did not mean it, and some part of me thinks she knew that too. Instead, while she slept off the exhaustion of our journey, I stayed at the console and kept listening to that strange, careless music drifting up from the planet below. I told myself I was gathering more data. I told myself a good archivist never leaves a discovery half-finished. The truth, if I am honest, is that I could not make myself look away. Hours passed. The music changed, shifted into other songs, other voices, some fast and joyful, others slow and full of longing, all of it broadcast openly, without fear, as if the people making it had never once imagined that something out here in the dark might be listening and might be afraid of them. Then, just past the edge of what our sensors could clearly resolve, something new appeared, a voice, clear, close, and speaking directly on an open channel that our ship happened to be tuned to by nothing more than accident. "Anyone out there?" the voice said, in a tone so casual it did not match the gravity of what it was actually doing. "If you can hear this, you have got a strange kind of static clinging to your signal. Come in if you want. We do not bite, usually." I froze. Reska woke instantly at the sound, some old instinct dragging her upright before her eyes had even opened. We stared at each other across the cabin, the open channel still humming quietly between us, waiting. Reska was the first to break the silence, her voice low, almost reverent. That voice sounded relaxed, she said, not guarded, not afraid, like whoever spoke it has no idea an old, dead probe is still sitting a few hours away, armed and waiting for exactly this kind of moment. I thought about the Mendrai probe drifting silently in the dark behind us, still faithfully executing an order given by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago, and I thought about the layered wreckage of every ship that had ever hovered where we were hovering now. 3 separate civilizations had stood exactly where we stood, listening to voices very much like the one still humming quietly on our open channel, and every single one of them had eventually chosen silence instead of an answer. Every civilization that had ever discovered this world, every single one, had chosen the same response to what we were now hearing: silence, retreat, and eventually extinction, followed by a warning carved into stone for whoever came looking next. My hand hovered over the console, close enough to answer, close enough to speak back into that open channel and become the first living being from the assembly to ever respond. I did not press it. Not yet. But I did not close the channel either. Whatever this world truly was, whatever secret 3 extinct species had died protecting the rest of the galaxy from, I understood in that moment that I was no longer simply studying it from a safe distance. I was standing at the edge of it, listening to a voice that did not sound like an ending at all. It sounded like an invitation. Reska finally spoke again, quietly, watching the open channel as if it might vanish if she looked away. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Do we answer, or do we run back to Halvern Reach and pretend none of this ever happened?" I did not have a good answer for her, not yet. Somewhere below us, on a world that 3 extinct civilizations had studied, feared, and quietly abandoned, a stranger had just spoken into the dark without knowing whether anyone dangerous might be listening. That kind of carelessness should have frightened me more than it did. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing I had encountered since this whole search began. A voice without calculation, without hidden agenda, simply reaching out because reaching out was what it did. I told Reska we would wait until morning, our morning, measured by the ship's own clock rather than any rhythm belonging to the world turning slowly beneath us. I told myself I needed the time to think clearly, to weigh the risk properly before doing something that could not be undone. The truth was simpler than that, and less comfortable to admit. I was afraid that if I answered too quickly, I would not be able to stop myself from telling this stranger everything: the warning, the debris, the probe still armed and waiting in the dark, before I understood any of it well enough to know whether doing so would help him or destroy him. So I left the channel open, and I watched the lights of that unfamiliar world turn slowly beneath us through the long hours that followed, unable to look away, unable to answer, caught somewhere between the fear that had ended 3 civilizations before me and the strange, stubborn hope that I might be able to end this pattern instead of repeating it. I closed the channel without answering, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the voice itself had been. Reska was already moving, pulling up every archive file we had brought with us, spreading them across the console like she could somehow force an answer out of raw data if she just looked hard enough. I understood the instinct. When something frightens you and you do not yet know why, the only comfort left is to keep working. "We are not ready to answer that channel," she said. "Not until we understand what actually happened to the ones who came before us." I agreed, though some part of me, the part that had heard that easy, unafraid voice drifting up from the planet below, did not want to wait at all. But she was right. 3 extinct species had orbited this exact world and left with nothing but fear and a warning. If we wanted to survive long enough to matter, we needed to know why. It took us the better part of a day to dig deep enough into the copied archive files to find what we were looking for. Most of what the assembly kept on record about extinct species was surface history, the kind written for schoolchildren and museum plaques. But buried underneath, sealed behind old clearance codes that Reska managed to work around through sheer stubbornness, were the original field logs, recordings left behind by the Threll, the Aura, and the Mendrai themselves, recovered from their own ruins and filed away where almost no one would ever think to look. Reska worked through the encryption layer by layer, muttering under her breath every time a new barrier appeared, each one clearly designed by someone who had never expected anybody to try this hard to get through. I asked her once, halfway through, whether she thought we were about to find something that would make more sense of the warning, or something that would only make it worse. "I do not think there is a version of this that makes it better," she said, without looking up from her work. "I think we are about to understand exactly how bad it already is." She was not wrong. When the final barrier finally gave way, the files that opened in front of us were not neat summaries or polished reports. They were raw, personal, the kind of recordings someone makes when they believe no one else will ever hear them, preserved only because whoever buried them could not quite bring themselves to destroy the truth entirely. We began with the Threll. Their recording was old and damaged, the audio warped by thousands of years of decay, but enough of it remained to understand. A Threll scholar, speaking in the calm, measured tone their entire culture had been famous for, describing a species built entirely around cold, perfect logic. Every decision the Threll ever made, according to their own records, was calculated first, weighed against 1,000 variables, and only then acted upon. It was, by their own account, the foundation of everything they had ever achieved. Their scholar described discovering this world much the way we had, drawn by faint signals and old rumors from an even older civilization that came before them. They studied the species below for years, cataloging behavior, running prediction models, building what they called a complete logical map of how these people would think and act in any given situation. The map never worked. The scholar's voice, even through the damage and decay of the recording, carried something close to genuine distress as they described it. Every model failed. Every prediction collapsed the moment it met reality. These people, this species the Threll studied so carefully, did not act according to expected outcomes. They made choices that offered no advantage. They took risks that no logical model would ever recommend, not for survival, not for gain, but simply because something mattered to them in a way the Threll had no framework to measure. There was more to the recording than the failed predictions. Later in the log, the scholar described something they called the unraveling, a slow crisis that spread through Threll society once word of their failed models became known beyond their small research team. If the future could not be calculated, the scholar explained, then every decision the Threll had ever made, every law, every structure of their entire civilization, built on the assumption that the correct outcome could always be found through careful reasoning, was suddenly in question. Trust in their own leaders collapsed within a single generation. Institutions that had stood for thousands of years dissolved not because anyone attacked them, but because nobody could agree anymore on how a decision should even be made once certainty was gone. The recording ended with a single line that Reska and I both sat with in silence for a long moment after it faded out. We built our entire civilization on the belief that outcomes could be calculated, the scholar said. We did not survive discovering a species that proved us wrong. I did not fully understand what that meant, not yet, but I felt the shape of something forming, a pattern I was not ready to name. We sat with the Threll recording for a long time before moving on to the next one. Reska kept replaying the final line, the scholar's admission that their entire civilization had been built on a belief that could not survive contact with something it could not predict. She asked me, quietly, whether I thought the assembly itself was built on anything sturdier. I did not have an honest answer for her. Every species in the assembly, mine included, prided itself on some particular strength, some defining trait that made it what it was. I wondered, listening to that broken recording, what it might reveal about my own people if we were ever studied as closely as the Threll had studied this world, and whether we would survive what we found looking back at us. Reska finally reached for the next file, her hand hovering over it for a moment before she opened it, as if some part of her already suspected it would not be any easier to hear than the first. The aura recording was different. Where the Threll had been calm even in their fear, the aura recording was raw, almost desperate, the voice of someone speaking into a recorder because they no longer had anyone left to speak to in person. The aura, according to their own history, were not a single mind, but they were close to it. Their entire civilization operated through a deep, constant connection between every member of their species, thoughts and decisions shared almost instantly across their whole population. It made them extraordinarily efficient. It also meant they had never, in their entire recorded history, needed to understand what it meant to face something that did not think the way they did. The aura recording described contact with this same world, contact that began peacefully enough, an attempt to understand a species that seemed, on the surface, disorganized and inefficient by every standard the aura valued. But the deeper they studied, the more the aura speaker's voice began to shake with something that sounded almost like grief. "They are not one thing," the recording said. "They are not 100 things. They are billions of things, all separate, all different, all pulling against each other, and somehow still building something greater than any single one of them could build alone. We tried to understand them as a whole, and there is no whole to understand. There is only every single one of them deciding for themselves, again and again, in ways we could never predict and could never truly join. The recording describes something the aura called a fracture, a slow unraveling of their shared connection as more and more of their people became fascinated, then obsessed, then quietly changed by what they observed. Some began to imagine what it might be like to think alone, to choose alone, the way this other species did. And for a civilization built entirely on unity, that fascination alone was enough to begin pulling them apart from the inside. "We did not lose a war," the final line of the recording said. "We lost the thing that made us one people, because we could not stop wondering what it might feel like to be many." Before that final line, the aura speaker described something that stayed with me long after the recording ended, a memory of standing among their own people during what they called the last true gathering, the final moment their entire population had still been joined as one shared mind. They described feeling, for the first time in their species' long history, something like loneliness, even while surrounded by billions of minds connected to their own. They had glimpsed, through their study of this other world, the strange and lonely freedom of choosing for oneself, and once glimpsed, it could not be unseen. Piece by piece, mind by mind, their unity thinned, until the connection that had defined them for longer than any record could measure simply faded into silence. Reska turned away from the console after that one, her arms wrapped around herself in a way I had never seen her do before. I understood the feeling. Something about hearing these voices, these final testimonies from civilizations that no longer existed, made the danger feel closer than any warning carved into stone ever could. The last recording belonged to the Mendrai, and it was the only one of the three that described anything close to open conflict. The Mendrai, by their own account, had once controlled 100 worlds. They were proud, expansionist, confident in a way the other two species clearly had not been. Their recording, delivered by a military commander rather than a scholar, described their first encounter with this world in far more aggressive terms. They had approached, not to observe, but to claim, sending a small force to establish a foothold before the local population could organize any meaningful resistance. It did not go the way they expected. The commander's voice was hard, even through the decay of the recording, but there was something underneath the hardness, something that sounded almost like respect, twisted through with fear. They described a species that should have been overwhelmed within days, lightly armed, scattered across dozens of separate nations that did not even fully trust each other. And yet, faced with an outside threat, those scattered nations found a way to set aside their differences almost overnight. They learned. Faster than any species the Mendrai had ever encountered. Every tactic the Mendrai used, every advantage, was studied, adapted, and turned back against them within a matter of months. "We came expecting conquest," the commander said. "We found a mirror instead, and it learned to fight back before we understood we had shown it how." The Mendrai withdrew after that first encounter, badly bloodied and deeply shaken, though by the recording's account, no lasting alliance between the two species was ever formed. The commander's final words on the recording were not a description of defeat in battle. They were something closer to a warning meant for anyone who came after. "Do not mistake their limitations for weakness," the recording said. "Everything we brought against them, they turned into a lesson. Given enough time, there will be nothing left about us that they have not already learned to overcome." The commander went on to describe the slow decline that followed their withdrawal, though it had nothing to do with any pursuit or counterattack from the world they left behind. It was, by the commander's own account, a crisis of confidence that spread through the Mendrai military first, then through their government, then through their people as a whole. An empire built on the certainty of conquest could not easily survive the knowledge that somewhere, on some small unshielded world, an enemy had studied their every tactic and turned it back against them within months. Other rivals within their own territory, sensing weakness for the first time in centuries, began testing borders that had once seemed unbreakable. The Mendrai did not fall to any single blow. They fell slowly, the way a structure falls once its foundation has quietly been proven false. The recording ended, and the cabin fell into a silence that stretched on for what felt like a very long time. I finally understood what the warning had always meant. Why 3 separate civilizations, spread across thousands of years and completely unaware of one another, had all reached the exact same terrified conclusion. It was never about weapons. It was never about numbers, or technology, or any of the ordinary measures the assembly used to judge a threat. Each of these species had looked at this world and, in doing so, had been forced to look at their own greatest weakness, reflected back at them with painful clarity. The Threll could not survive a species that refused to be predicted. The Aura could not survive a species that could not be unified into anything less than itself. The Mendrai could not survive a species that learned faster than it could be conquered. They had not left a warning because this world was dangerous in any way the assembly understood danger. They had left a warning because encountering it had, each time, exposed a fatal flaw buried deep in their own civilization, a flaw that eventually finished the work this world had only started. Never wake the humans. It was never a threat against them. It was a confession about themselves. Reska sat quietly across from me for a long while after I said that out loud, turning the thought over the way she turned over any difficult translation, testing it from every angle before she was willing to accept it as true. Finally, she nodded, slowly, and said the thing I had not yet been brave enough to say myself. "If that is true," she said, "then the Assembly's own protocol, the one built specifically to deal with worlds like this one, was never designed to protect anyone from a real threat. It was designed to protect frightened people from ever having to face themselves. And if that is what it is, then whoever sent that patrol out here today is not planning to study this world. They are planning to erase it, quietly, the same way it has already been erased 3 times before." I did not want to believe that either, but the shape of it fit too well against everything we had just heard to dismiss. I thought of Kale's face when he had told me to forget what I found, the particular kind of fear in his eyes that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with a decision already made long before I ever walked into his office. I was still turning that thought over in my mind when the ship's proximity alarm tore through the cabin for the second time that day, sharper and far more urgent than before. Reska was at the console instantly, and this time the reading on her screen was not music, and it was not an old debris field. It was a ship. A real one, sleek and unmistakably assembly in design, dropping out of transit less than half a system away and already adjusting course directly toward us. I asked her if it was possible that it was simply a patrol, unrelated to us, passing through by coincidence. She read the transponder signal aloud, and I felt my stomach drop. It was registered to Halvern Reach. Someone back at the station had noticed the stolen ship missing far sooner than I had hoped, and someone with far more authority than either of us had decided that whatever we had found out here needed to be contained rather than reported. As the incoming ship grew closer on our display, I understood with sudden, cold clarity that we were no longer just archivists chasing a mystery. We had become a problem that someone intended to solve. The incoming ship closed the distance faster than I thought possible, and by the time its outline resolved clearly on our display, I recognized the design immediately. A Cultural Preservation Council enforcement vessel, the kind sent when the Council decided a discovery needed to be contained rather than studied. Reska immediately began plotting evasive courses, her hands flying across the navigation controls with the kind of focus that only comes from genuine fear. I asked her if we had any real chance of outrunning a ship built specifically to catch vessels like ours, and she did not look up from her work when she answered. "Not for long," she said. Long enough to think, maybe. Not long enough to escape. I watched the enforcement vessel's course adjust in perfect synchronization with every move we made, closing the gap steadily no matter which direction Reska tried, until it became clear that running was never going to be an option that ended well for either of us. Whoever was piloting that ship knew exactly how a stolen survey vessel like ours would move, which told me, with a sinking feeling, that it had almost certainly been sent by someone who had trained me himself. Reska read the hailing signal aloud the moment it came through, her voice tight with a fear I had not heard from her before. Nora Vance and Reska Ilvain, the transmission said, in a voice I recognized at once. It was Kale. You are ordered to power down your engines and prepare for boarding. This system is now under council restriction. Whatever you have found, it ends here. I stared at the console, my hands frozen over the controls. Some part of me, the part that had spent 6 years following rules without question, wanted to obey. Kale had trained me. Kale had trusted me with responsibilities far beyond my rank. Some part of me still believed, even now, that he might have a good reason for what he was doing. But I thought of the 3 recordings we had just listened to. 3 civilizations, each one ended not by the world below us, but by the fear that came from studying it too closely, without ever being brave enough to actually speak to it. 3 warnings, carved into stone by people who had chosen silence and paid for that choice with everything they were. I was not going to make the same mistake. I told Reska to hold our position and reached for the open channel I had left untouched since the strange, easy voice had first reached us from the planet below. My hand shook as I opened it again, and for a moment I could not find any words at all. Then I simply spoke, because there was nothing left to do but try. This is Nora Vance, I said. I am not from your world. I am reaching out because I believe I am the only chance either of us has left to avoid repeating a very old mistake. The silence that followed felt endless. Behind us, the enforcement vessel continued its approach, close enough now that Reska warned me we had only minutes before it would be in range to disable our engines by force. Then the voice answered, and this time it did not sound casual at all. It sounded alert, careful, and unmistakably curious. This is Daniel Ashcroft, research vessel Halcyon, the voice said. I am going to be honest with you, because that seems like the right call right now. We picked up something on our sensors that should not exist according to any science we have, and now you are telling me you are not from my world. So I am going to ask you plainly, are you here to hurt us? I told him the truth, because there was no time left for anything else. No, I said, but there is a ship behind me that might be here to hurt you, and I do not have long to explain why. I gave him the short version, the only version I had time for. I told him about the warning carved into the ruins of 3 extinct species. I told him about the layered debris in his own planet's orbit, proof that his world had been watched, studied, and quietly abandoned by frightened visitors more than once across thousands of years. I told him that the ship closing in behind us belonged to an organization that might, at this very moment, be preparing to make certain his world never had the chance to be found again. I could hear voices behind him now, more than one, low and urgent. Someone asking him who he was talking to and why the whole comms deck had gone quiet to listen. Daniel did not answer them right away. When he spoke again, it was to me, and his voice had a careful edge to it, the sound of someone trying very hard to stay calm while everything around him suggested he should not be. You said proof, he said. You said you have proof this has happened before. I need you to understand something. My people have old stories, older than anyone can properly date, about visitors from the sky who came and went and left nothing behind but strange, half-remembered dreams that never quite made sense the next morning. We always assumed they were just stories. Are you telling me they were not? I told him I believed they were not, and that whatever had erased the details each time, it had never quite managed to erase the feeling that something important had happened. Daniel was quiet for a long moment after I finished. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, steadier now, though I could hear something underneath it that might have been anger, or might have been something closer to grief. "You are telling me this has happened before," he said. "That we have met people like you before, and every single time, they just erased it, wiped it clean, and left." I told him I believed that was exactly what had happened, over and over, for longer than either of our species had any real memory of. "That is why you do not remember any of it," I said. "Every time it happened, whoever found you made sure you never would." The enforcement ship drew closer still, filling more and more of our forward display with every passing second, and Reska called out its status in a voice that had gone tight and clipped with fear. "Shields at full power," she said. "Weapons systems beginning to warm. Nora, they are not bluffing." I kept my eyes on the open channel instead of the display, because looking at the enforcement ship felt like it might make the fear too large to think past. Behind me, Reska's voice cut through sharply, warning me that the enforcement ship had entered weapons range and was demanding we cut our transmission immediately or be treated as a hostile vessel. I did not cut the transmission. "Daniel," I said, forcing my voice steady even as my hands were not, "I need you to trust me for exactly as long as it takes to explain one more thing, and then I need you to make a choice, because I am not going to be able to make it for you." He told me to go ahead, and something in the way he said it, calm despite everything, made me understand a little of what those 3 extinct recordings had been trying to describe. Not recklessness, not lack of fear, just a strange, stubborn steadiness that refused to break even when the situation clearly called for panic. I told him about the pattern hidden in the recordings we had recovered, that every civilization who had ever studied his world too closely had eventually been undone, not by his people directly, but by the fear his people's very existence had exposed in them. I told him the ship behind me almost certainly intended to carry out something called a corrective dormancy protocol, an old council procedure meant to quietly erase every trace of an emerging civilization judged too dangerous to be allowed contact with the wider galaxy. "They are not going to attack your cities," I said. "That is not how it has ever worked before. They are going to try to make it look like nothing was ever here at all." The line stayed open, and for the first time since it began, I heard other voices behind Daniel's, low and urgent, people asking him what was happening, what they were supposed to do. Kale's voice cut through my own channel at that exact moment, sharp and final. "Vance," he said, "close that transmission now. This is your last warning. If you make contact, you will be treated as an active threat to Council containment protocol, and I will not be able to protect you from what happens next." I looked at the small red light on my console, the one that meant the transmission to Daniel's ship was still live, still open, still carrying every word I said straight down to a world that had been silenced 3 times before and had never once been given the chance to say no for itself. I thought about the Threll, who calculated everything and still could not survive the fear of what they could not predict. I thought about the Aura, who lost themselves trying to remain whole while watching a species that thrived precisely because it never was. I thought about the Mendrai commander, who called this world a mirror and fled from what he saw reflected in it. I thought about every warning carved into stone by hands that no longer existed, and I understood, finally and completely, that those warnings had never been meant to protect anyone from the humans at all. They had been meant to protect frightened civilizations from having to look honestly at themselves. I was not going to add my own name to that list. "I am not closing the channel," I told Kale, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "I am done being part of something that erases people because they are inconvenient to be afraid of." Kale did not respond with words. Instead, the enforcement vessel's engines flared bright against the dark, closing the last of the distance between us far faster than our own small ship could ever hope to outrun. Daniel's voice came back through the open channel, urgent now, but not afraid in the way I expected. "Whatever is about to happen," he said, "tell me what we can do. Do not tell me to hide. My people have never once gotten to choose how this went." Give us the chance to choose now. Reska turned to me from the secondary console, her expression caught somewhere between terror and a strange, fierce kind of hope, and I understood in that moment that there was no version of this that ended quietly. The enforcement ship was close enough now that its shape filled half our forward display, weapons ports opening slowly along its hull, and somewhere far below us, on a world that had been silenced 3 times and had never once been asked what it wanted, a man named Daniel Ashcroft was waiting for an answer. I gave him one. "Hold your position," I said. "Do not run. Do not hide. For the first time in your history, you are not going to be erased without a fight, because this time, someone is standing beside you instead of walking away." The enforcement ship's weapons finished charging, and the last thing I heard, before everything happened at once, was Daniel's voice, steady and unafraid, echoing the same 5 words that had haunted 3 dead civilizations across 10,000 years of silence, except now they did not sound like a warning at all. They sounded like a promise. "We are not going anywhere." I gripped the edge of the console, watching the enforcement ship's weapons finish their charge, and I thought of every quiet, frightened choice that had led 3 entire civilizations to this exact same moment before me. Each of them had faced some version of this same instant, a world waiting below, a voice unwilling to be silenced, and each of them had chosen fear over honesty. I was not going to make that same choice twice. Reska's hand found mine across the narrow space between our seats, steady despite everything, and together we watched the light of the enforcement ship's weapons grow brighter against the dark, waiting to see whether this would finally be the moment the pattern broke, or the moment it simply repeated itself one more time. The enforcement ship fired a warning shot across our bow, close enough that our whole cabin shook and half the console lights flickered out before stuttering back to life. Reska grabbed the edge of her seat to keep from being thrown, and I fought to keep our small ship steady, my hands moving faster than my thoughts could keep up with. Sparks scattered from a burst panel near the rear of the cabin, and for one terrifying moment the whole ship lurched sideways before the stabilizers caught and steadied us again. Reska was already moving, pulling a small extinguisher from beneath her seat and dousing the panel before the spark could catch on anything else, coughing through the thin haze of smoke that followed. "We do not have long," she said, her voice hoarse. "Next shot will not be a warning." "That was not meant to hit us," Reska said, breathless. "That was meant to make us stop." I knew she was right, and I knew we had only seconds before whatever came next would not miss on purpose. I opened every channel our ship had left, not just the one to Daniel's vessel, but every frequency the assembly used across this entire sector, wide and unshielded and completely against every protocol I had ever been trained to follow. If Kale was going to silence me, he was going to have to do it in front of everyone. "This is Nora Vance, archivist, formerly assigned to Halvern Reach," I said, my voice carrying out across space on every channel I could reach. "I am transmitting proof that the species catalogued as extinct under assembly designation Homo sapiens is alive, active, and has been repeatedly discovered and repeatedly erased by frightened civilizations for over 10,000 years. I am transmitting the original field recordings recovered from 3 extinct species who each independently reached the same conclusion and each independently chose silence instead of honesty. I am transmitting it all, right now, because I believe someone out there deserves to know the truth before it happens a 4th time." I did not wait for permission. I sent the recordings, all of them, the Threll scholar's calm and broken voice, the Aura speaker's grief over a fracture that could not be repaired, the Mendrai commander's warning about a mirror his people had been too afraid to keep looking into. I sent every scrap of evidence Reska and I had gathered, pouring it out across open space where anyone listening, friend or enemy, could hear it. Kale's voice came back sharp and furious over the enforcement ship's channel. "You do not understand what you are doing," he said. "This is not about erasing anyone. It is about survival. Every species that made contact with them lost something essential about themselves. You are not protecting them by exposing this. You are dooming everyone who listens to you. I thought of what I had learned in that broken chamber on a nameless moon, and for the first time, I understood exactly how to answer him. They did not lose themselves because of contact, I said. They lost themselves because they were too afraid to make it honestly. They studied instead of spoke. They calculated instead of listened. They tried to conquer instead of understand. Every single one of them ran from the mirror instead of looking into it long enough to change what they saw. That is not the fault of the people on that world below us. That is the fault of everyone who was too frightened to be honest with themselves. For a long moment, there was only silence on the channel, broken only by the low hum of the enforcement ship's engines drawing closer. I watched the seconds tick past on our display, each one feeling longer than the last, and I understood that this broadcast, once sent, could never be taken back. Whatever happened next, the truth was already loose among the stars, spreading faster than any single ship could hope to contain it. Reska gripped my shoulder, her eyes fixed on the enforcement vessel's hull, still glowing faintly along its weapons ports. "Whatever happens now," she said quietly, "they cannot make this disappear anymore. Too many people already heard it." Then, unexpectedly, another voice broke into the transmission, one I did not recognize at all, older and calmer than either mine or Kale's, carrying the unmistakable authority of someone speaking from far beyond this system. "This is Counselor Illyra Vance," the new voice said, and speaks with something close to disbelief, transmitting from Assembly Central. "I am reviewing the recordings currently being broadcast across this entire sector. Enforcement vessel, you are ordered to stand down immediately and hold position until a formal review can be conducted." I did not know, until that exact moment, that I even had family serving on the council itself, distant enough that the name had never come up in conversation, but close enough that hearing it now sent a strange shiver through me that had nothing to do with fear. Kale's voice, when it returned, sounded far less certain than before. "Counselor," he said carefully, "this is an active containment situation. The protocol exists for good reason." The counselor's response was immediate and left no room for argument. "The protocol exists because 10,000 years ago, someone decided that erasing frightened civilizations quietly was easier than teaching them to be brave," she said. "I have just listened to 3 field recordings that prove exactly how well that decision has worked out. Stand down, Enforcer Doran." That is not a request. The enforcement ship's weapons ports, still glowing faintly along its hull, slowly dimmed and closed. For a long moment nobody spoke, and the only sound in our small cabin was Reska letting out a breath she had clearly been holding since the first warning shot. I reopened the channel to Daniel's ship, my hands finally steady for the first time since this had all begun. "Are you still there?" I asked. His voice came back immediately, and for the first time since we had started talking, I heard something in it that might have been relief. "We are still here," he said. "We are always still here. That seems to be the one thing nobody who ever met us managed to account for." The review that followed took the better part of 2 days, conducted across open channels that Counselor Vance insisted remain public rather than sealed behind the usual layers of council secrecy. I testified, Reska testified, even Daniel spoke, patched through from his own ship, answering questions from voices belonging to species he had never known existed until 3 days earlier, calm and steady through every single one of them. One counselor, representing a species I had never even heard of before that day, asked Daniel directly what he thought his people would do if the assembly chose to formally invite them into contact with the wider galaxy. His answer was simple, delivered without any of the practiced polish the other witnesses used. "I think we would ask a lot of questions," he said. "I think we would probably argue about it amongst ourselves for a very long time, because that is what we do about almost everything. But I do not think we would run from it, and I do not think we would be quiet about it either. We have spent however long being erased without ever getting a say. I would like the chance to actually have one." That answer, more than anything Reska or I had said in 2 days of testimony, seemed to settle something in the room. I watched the debate shift after that, away from questions of danger and containment, and towards something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind that should have driven every single encounter with this world from the very beginning. By the end of it, the Council's ruling was simple, and it was the first time in recorded assembly history that anything like it had ever been ordered. The corrective dormancy protocol, the quiet erasure procedure that had ended 3 civilizations' contact with this world before any of them ever admitted the truth, was permanently suspended. Not just for this system, entirely. Struck from assembly protocol as what it had always truly been, a tool built from fear rather than wisdom. Kale was reassigned, quietly and without ceremony, to a research post far from any position of authority. I never spoke to him again after that final channel closed, though I heard, much later, that he eventually requested a transfer to archive work, the same quiet, careful profession I had once believed was the safest, most predictable path anyone could choose. I understood, in a strange way, exactly why he made that choice. Reska stayed with the assembly, though she moved from records work into something closer to diplomacy, insisting that after everything we had uncovered, someone needed to make sure the next discovery, whatever and wherever it turned out to be, would never again be handled with silence and fear instead of honesty. As for me, I returned to that same nameless moon, to the same broken thrall chamber where all of this had started, though this time I did not go alone, and I did not go in secret. I brought a full survey team, proper permits, and enough support to finally excavate the site the way it deserved to be excavated. The excavation itself took several months, longer than I expected, though I found I did not mind the slow pace this time. There was no fear driving my hands now, no sense of a clock running out somewhere behind me. We uncovered the rest of the chamber carefully, piece by piece, and found records far beyond the single warning that had started everything. Records describing the thrall as they had once been, curious and careful, and in their own quiet way, not so different from the people they had once studied from a distance and never dared to speak with. I stood again in front of that ancient wall, the one carved with the same 5 words repeated over and over by hands that had been dust for 9,000 years, and I read them one final time. Never wake the humans. I did not erase it. I did not believe it deserved to be erased, because in its own broken, frightened way, it had led me here, to the truth underneath it. Instead, beside the ancient carving, I added a plaque of my own, in a language every visiting species to that moon would be able to read. They were never asleep, it said. We only ever told ourselves that, so we would not have to be honest about what frightened us. The warning was true. What it meant was wrong. Word of what happened at that system spread slowly at first, then faster, carried across the assembly by people who could not quite believe a story that sounded, on its surface, like something out of an old legend. A species presumed extinct for 10,000 years, alive and thriving the entire time, silenced not by any weapon or disease, but by the quiet, repeated fear of everyone who ever found them. Daniel's world did not remain silent for long after that. Within a year, their first official transmission reached beyond their own system, simple and unpolished compared to the practiced diplomacy of older assembly worlds, but honest in a way that seemed to catch the attention of everyone who heard it. It was not a declaration of strength. It was not a demand for recognition. It was, in Daniel's own words, spoken during that first broadcast, something closer to an introduction long overdue. We do not know everything about what is out there, he said, in a recording that eventually reached nearly every corner of assembly space. We have been told, apparently, more than once, that we were too dangerous to be allowed to find out. We would like the chance to prove that wrong, on our own terms, in our own time. We are not asking for permission. We are simply saying hello, finally, after what I am told was a very long and very unfair silence. I listened to that broadcast from my small quarters at Halvern Reach, sitting alone in the quiet, and I found myself smiling in a way I had not expected. 3 civilizations had once looked at this world and seen only a reflection of everything they feared about themselves. They had chosen silence, and silence had cost them everything they were. I had chosen differently, and though it had nearly cost me my career, my safety, and very nearly my life, I did not regret a single moment of it. Somewhere out among the stars, a world that had been erased and forgotten 3 times over was finally being allowed to speak for itself, loud and unafraid, exactly the way it always should have been. And for the first time in 10,000 years, nobody was rushing to make it quiet again. I still keep a copy of that first broadcast, Daniel's voice, steady and unpolished, saved among my own personal records, alongside the 3 old recordings that started everything. I listen to it sometimes, when the quiet of the archive halls feels too much like the silence that once ended 3 entire civilizations. It reminds me that silence is not always safety. Sometimes it is simply the last sound a frightened people make before they disappear. The assembly is different now, slowly, the way large things always change, one uncomfortable truth at a time. New protocols exist for first contact, built around listening rather than containment, around curiosity rather than fear. I do not know if they will hold, not truly, not for another 10,000 years. Fear has a long memory, and old habits do not vanish simply because one warning was finally answered honestly. But I know this much. The next time someone finds a world humming quietly with a strange, careless kind of music, unafraid and unaware of who might be listening, they will not find a warning carved into stone telling them to leave it silent. They will find, if I have anything to say about it, an open door instead.